This video is sponsored by FlexiSpot, who I've worked with multiple times, and really it's entirely thanks to FlexiSpot that I have a functioning workspace at all. I'll tell you all about FlexiSpot a little bit later. For now, let me thank my patrons. Your names are on screen. Thank you so much for your support. Every month I do fun exclusive stuff over there, including a postcard, a sticker that gets mailed to you, as well as an exclusive video, podcast, and more, so go check it out. I have a lot of watercolor palettes, like a lot. So many, and I've tried to get rid of some and pare down. These are the ones that I thought were keepers. These are the ones that made it past the cut. They all have something special about them, some reason to keep them. But on top of all these palettes, I also have an alarming amount of tubed watercolor paints. Again, these are just the ones that made the cut. I have multiple different brands, so I've had it in my mind for a while now that it would be really cool and fun to make my own custom watercolor palette. I thought it'd be a really good idea to throw in a few gouache colors with the palette as well. I could really make something that would work well for me and my specific needs, The only thing was I didn't have an empty palette until somewhat recently. I worked with Meeden and one of the products they sent me was an empty palette, so it was perfect. This palette fits 26 colors, but it does have the blank row in the middle that would fit some number more of half pans. I only have 3 empty half pans right now, so I thought I would save filling that row for later when I have enough pans and get a feel for how this palette works as is and see what's kind of missing from it later on. I really wanted to put a lot of thought and effort into this project. I'm not just doing this for fun because it seems cool, although that is also true, but I really want a unique palette that will have a little bit of everything that I need for my average everyday project. So I had to take all of these watercolor tubes and figure out which 26 colors were making it into my palette. And to do that, I had to swatch nearly every single color. I started with my Paul Rubens set. This is one of my favorite watercolor sets. Every time I use them, I am blown away by their performance. I think they're just so gorgeous, and I still haven't been able to part with the packaging they came in because it's just so beautiful. But I really do rarely use them because for me, tubed watercolors are just never convenient to reach for. Like, I prefer them for a very intentional and serious piece, but I don't do those a whole lot. So I was excited to have some of these colors in my palette so that I would finally use them more often. These colors are seriously so wonderful. I had so much fun swatching them. Like, come on, they look so good. Look at that. For swatching, I just wanted to keep it very simple and super, minimal waste. So I just literally opened the tube and just stuck my brush inside. Honestly, this also ended up being an indicator to the pigment's performance. Obviously, some brands held up better than others, but I definitely noticed that some pigments separated a lot more or didn't hold up well to time or weren't thick or sturdy enough. And so just dipping my brush in would result in a really oily or watered down swatch. And that was good to know. I probably don't want to use those pigments in my palette. I also got to see how each pigment moved on paper. Of course, I had to keep in mind that these paints could perform very differently once dried and then reactivated. I don't know much about the science behind paint pigments, so I frankly have no idea how all that works or if there's really much of a change at all. But obviously, when you're using a paint that is already wet, because it's a liquid, it's much easier to get it to move while keeping its opacity and saturation, rather than when you've got a dry pan and you need a lot of water to get it to move easier. That can obviously water your paints down and desaturate them. So I had to keep that in mind when swatching my paints, that what I was seeing might not be exactly what I would see later. After swatching each color between brands, I went through and made a note of all the colors that I liked, anything I thought I would want to revisit or have in my palette. For each color I picked out, I also wrote its pigment name down so I could keep track of what specific colors I'm interested in. I also realized that I already knew some of the paints I definitely wanted in my palette, so I wanted to mark down those in my notes as well. And off the bat, I knew I wanted gouache white and black in my palette, so I pulled those out to swatch as well. Let's take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, FlexiSpot. Obviously, you're watching me work at my absolutely favorite desk, which is from FlexiSpot. You guys see me use this desk in pretty much every video. It's where I pack orders, do Patreon stuff. I do art there when I'm thinking I'm not going to be too messy. I try really hard to keep this desk looking perfect because I just think it's so pretty. But it's just so perfect with my workflow. It makes my space look so much nicer and more organized. I also use another FlexiSpot desk for my editing station in another room, and overall my love for FlexiSpot has really solidified over time. So much so that I recommend it to anyone who's looking for a desk, especially if they're a freelancer or a creative or they work from home. This specific desk is actually a gift to a friend who does a lot of work from home. They're a freelancer as well. They also do a lot of gaming and filming and computer stuff, and so they really needed a big work area where kind of all of their stuff would fit onto one workspace. And I was like, you know what would work perfect for you? FlexiSpot's E7 desk. What's great about a standing desk is that for those of us who do work from home, we end up sitting in the same place pretty much all day, every day. I know I can get super restless. My legs and back will start to hurt just from being stuck in one position, you know? And for me, there's a lot of work that I need to do that is easier to do while standing. I need to be able to move around more, like for packing orders is a great example. I'm kind of spread out on this huge surface area, and I need to get from one stack of stuff to another. Having a desk that allows you to easily spread out like that, but to also do it at any height that works for you is really such a game changer. I love being able to fully adjust the height of my desk for all sorts of projects and needs. If I'm sitting at a bar stool at my desk, you know, depending on what I'm working on, I might need it at different standing heights. Even just being able to raise and lower it for capturing certain angles while filming is really, really helpful. FlexiSpot really has made working from home in my pretty small space so much more comfortable and efficient. I love how much stuff I can pack on these desks, under these desks, and my friend here has lots of gaming and computer and work equipment, and I know that with the E7's weight capacity of 440 pounds, there are absolutely no worries there. The motor is really quiet, it can remember your height settings, and it's super, super stable, so I never worry about things falling over while changing the height. Even if it's a full bottle of paint water, I'm never worried about it. There are just so many desk options at FlexiSpot, so many aesthetic choices. Like, these desks are beautiful. I love the way they look. You really can't go wrong with a FlexiSpot desk. I'll link them down below, so if you want to grab yourself a desk or even an ergonomic chair, you can totally do that. You can also use my code overall. I can't recommend them enough, so go check out FlexiSpot. Now, like I said, I have a lot of tubes. A while ago, in attempts to downsize, I got rid of a lot of the individual packaging for all the different sets and brands, and I put them all into the really large Arteza watercolor box. Opening that box and seeing all the mixed up sets was actually really overwhelming. So before I could really tackle them properly, I needed to go through and separate all the brands just as a mental first step. I ended up having 5 more brands to swatch: Meeden, Grumbacher, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, and Arteza. Again, still a lot of tubes, and it was still overwhelming. So I started by removing any of the colors I absolutely knew I didn't want or need in my palette to hopefully minimize the amount I would have to go through and actually swatch. As fun as swatching is, I was having so much fun, my hands were already hurting from twisting off so many tiny caps, and it was frankly, it was very time consuming. My next brand to swatch was Meeden. I made sure to do it in rainbow order, for aesthetics, of course, but also to help my brain easily compare the colors. Like, having all the reds next to each other helps me compare them directly to each other and narrow down which ones I actually would find valuable in my palette. So let me tell you what kind of colors I was looking for. Initially, through the first pass of each brand, it was kind of gut instinct. Just, do I like this color? Is it pretty and good quality? But beyond that, I was of course thinking about what colors do I use regularly? Whenever I do a watercolor painting, I usually am pulling out multiple pans plus some gouache tubes. There's always at least one color missing from any given palette, whether it be a nice purple, a bright green, a pure red, a really bright teal or blue, black or white. So I was thinking about, what are my favorite and most used colors in each of my already existing palettes? And what colors am I always having to supplement or make up for with those same palettes? What colors do I use a lot in general throughout any medium? What do I gravitate towards or find pretty in art? All that kind of stuff. When going through and choosing them after swatching, I also took into consideration what colors I picked from the previous brand. Just because I had picked a similar color didn't mean I couldn't pick it again and directly compare them later, but also I didn't need to pick 8 yellows just because they were all pretty, As I went, I packed away colors that weren't picked but left out the ones I had liked so I could easily pull them out again later. I also was taking into consideration things like saturation. If they took multiple dips of the paintbrush to get a good color on the paper, I probably wouldn't want those in my palette. Some paints were very gummy or separated on the paper. I didn't want too many repeat colors, like I didn't want half of my palette to be reds or greens, but I also wanted all of my bases covered. Like, I often wish I had a very nice pink color to mix with, and in my favorite gouache palette, I love having a warm and cool version of each color. So having multiple of one color was not necessarily a bad thing either. I wanted to make sure I had all the staples, things like a yellow ochre and all the different types of browns, because those really can come in handy and serve different purposes. So there was really a lot to take into consideration when swatching and picking colors, and I had to think about the slots that were kind of already eaten up by things like the staples. But I also wanted to make sure that I kept room for more fun things. So there was a lot going on in my head, and taking notes while I went was really, really helpful. As colors were drying on the paper, I also noticed that some had different and kind of weird finishes. Some were really shiny, or they dried really tacky, and those were automatic no's. Again, another reason it was really, really great that I was taking notes as I went. When it came time to swatch the Arteza colors, I knew that these would take a while. Arteza has a lot of very specific pre-mixed pigments. Like there's 1,000 like nude and neutrals. The thing about most paints, like paints in general, not just watercolor, is that you really don't need a whole lot of individual hyper-specific colors because they're just so easy to mix. It's super common to see extremely limited color palettes. There's the Zorn palette, red, yellow, blue, black, white, because you can still get super wide ranges of colors with just those few tubes. So I thought I really probably would not need a lot of these Arteza tubes. They're definitely fun and cool in theory, very pretty to look at, and I think having a wide variety makes sense for tubes. Since this would be a dry palette, I'd always be able to mix my own colors. However, I knew that there would be a few colors in this set that would be really convenient to have already mixed, to be able to mix with, or would be really hard to mix myself. For example, the fluorescent pink. That would be really hard for me to mix myself. I did think about leaving out neons because I actually have a specialty palette specifically of neon colors, and if I put neons in this palette, it would make that one like moot and pointless. But I think this pink is actually a very different hue than my neon palette, and also neons are so much fun. I love to use them, and I thought if the point of this palette is that it's unique to me and my needs and it's kind of a one-stop shop to take with me somewhere, then I should have a neon in there too. You know, I think it's a staple of mine. I pulled out some of my loose tubes of gouache. I decided to leave out my Holbein gouache, that set, because if I'm going to use one of those tubes, I'm going to use the whole set anyways. You know what I mean? I never will just use one color. So I pulled out some of the loose stuff to swatch instead. And these loose ones are ones that I don't really use that often, so I think having them in this palette will also be a great way to get me to actually use those. Once I swatched all of the colors, I pulled out all the ones that had interested me and swatched them again. I wanted to be able to see all of them next to each other without all the other distracting, dejected paints next to them. I wanted to see if I had any overly repeating pigments, if I was leaning too heavily on one color, and if they all worked well together as a cohesive palette. Once they were all next to each other, I could definitely see that one brand's version of one color was maybe way better than the other brands, or that some pigments were way too weak in comparison to the rest of the palette, or it just didn't go well with the other colors. I was confident that I had narrowed it down to the final 26 choices, and it was time to once again swatch all of the paints so I could see what the final palette would look like. I also wanted to test some of the primary colors to make sure they mixed well together, as I had definitely learned that just because it's technically a primary color does not mean that it is a mixable color. My last step of swatching was to write down the name and brand of all the colors to use as reference later if I ever needed to share what's in my palette or to remember what to refill pans with. Here are my final color selections. Holbein Black Gouache, White Gouache, Winsor & Newton Venetian Red, Winsor & Newton Windsor Red, Winsor & Newton Linden Green, Paul Rubens Burnt Sienna, Paul Rubin Indian Red, Paul Rubin Quinacridone Violet, Grumbacher Carmine, Arteza Neon Pink, Paul Rubin Pyrrole Ruby Red, Paul Rubin Cadmium Red Light, Paul Rubin Indian Yellow, Arteza Apricot, Paul Rubin Cadmium Yellow Light, Arteza Naples Yellow, Van Gogh Yellow Ochre, Paul Rubin May Green, Arteza Olive Green, Paul Rubin Olive Green Dark, Mead and Phthalo Green, Paul Rubin Cobalt Turquoise, Paul Rubin Translucent Turquoise, Paul Rubin Azure Blue, Da Vinci and Danthrone Blue, Paul Rubin Indigo. And finally, it was time to fill palettes. I did a bit of research before doing this, but frankly, it seemed fairly straightforward, so I mostly just jumped right in. I had toothpicks on hand. You can also use like a needle or a paper clip, which is obviously less wasteful, but I didn't want to have to clean the needle between every use. You know, I had already been at this for hours, so I was trying to save time. It was a very easy process. I squeezed the tube first into one corner, then along that bottom crease, then into another corner. I did that all the way around the bottom and then started filling up the center until it was about halfway to almost all the way full. The amount that I filled each pan is totally random. I just at some point wasn't paying it, like sometimes I wasn't paying attention to how much I was doing, or some paint flowed easier than others. Some were super liquidy and filled it really, really well, really quickly. Some were thicker and took a bit more work to spread throughout the pan. So the level that they're filled is entirely random. To make sure that it did spread throughout the entire pan, I took a toothpick and basically stabbed it in repeatedly, focusing first on the corners to make sure the paint properly got all the way in there, and then throughout the pan to get rid of any air bubbles and to help the paint settle evenly. And then I did that for the 26 tubes of paint. At this point, my fingers were in so much pain from opening these tubes. I did six sets of brand sets, and then I did my 26 to 30 selected ones about two or three more times. It was a lot of tube opening. So I was pretty ready to be done. The whole process was really cool and fun, but I may have gone a bit too extreme to do it all in one day. Oh, and then I did notice that I had way too many leftover pans than tubes to squeeze, so I did have a moment of panic. Like, I know I counted correctly. I know I picked the right number of paints for this final palette, so what on earth is going on? Somehow I had missed two of my yellow tubes, and I had to do some rearranging in the pan, but thankfully I had all my paints there still, so crisis averted. I also kept all of my gouache paints all together, so they're not like blended into the rainbow. I didn't want to lose track of what was gouache and what was watercolor, so I kept them in their own little corner. I don't know if that's necessarily needed, like I'm sure I will be able to tell the difference, but I actually think it does look kind of cool, looks kind of purposeful. It was really, really cool to see the whole thing take shape, and I was so happy with the final product and the final color choices. Of course, it could take up to a week for these paints to dry. For some reason, I had it in my head that it was going to happen overnight. So I woke up the next morning ready to like show you guys the final product, but obviously all the pans are still very wet. But either way, I think it looks beautiful. Like it looks so satisfying. I want to eat it. And I'm so excited to finally get to test it out whenever they dry. That is it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching and joining me on this little project today. I had so much fun. It's a bit of a different video. I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did enjoy it, like the video, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. And thanks so much to FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video. I really can't recommend FlexiSpot enough. They have all sorts of office furniture to fit your needs. If you need a standing desk or an ergonomic chair, desk accessories, like they've got it. You can check out their E7 frame. That's what I use for what I've been using in this video, as well as the one that I set up in this video. It has the T-frame legs. That one is definitely my favorite. But if you're looking for one that's a bit more budget friendly, you can check out their E2 model. It's only $150. You can use my code YBT30 for $30 off your order of over $500. Thank you guys again. I hope you had a wonderful day. Bye. See you next time.